From New York, this is Democracy Now!
It is insane that a 16-year-old have to cross the Atlantic Ocean to make a stand. The climate and ecological crisis is a global crisis and the biggest crisis humanity has ever faced. And if we don't manage to work together, to cooperate and to work together despite our differences, then we will fail.
After a 2-week-long journey across the Atlantic, Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg arrives in New York City Wednesday afternoon on an emissions-free yacht. Over 1,000 people greeted the 16-year-old, who will now begin a months-long trip through the Americas to sound the alarm about the climate crisis. We'll play highlights of Greta's first speech in New York and news conference. Then, a constitutional crisis in the United Kingdom, where Prime Minister Boris Johnson has suspended Parliament in a move to push forward Brexit with or without a deal. Thousands took the streets of London and across Britain with cries to stop the coup.
Suspending Parliament is not acceptable. It's not on. What the Prime Minister is doing is a sort of smash and grab on our democracy in order to force through a no-deal exit from the European Union. What's he so afraid of that he needs to suspend Parliament to prevent Parliament discussing these matters?
Then we remember the legendary peace activist Francis Crowe, who died at the age of 100 in Northampton, Massachusetts.
When people ask me, how many times have you been arrested? And I say, not enough.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The Trump administration's planning to make it easier for oil and gas companies to pollute the atmosphere with methane gas, one of the most powerful greenhouse gases contributing to the global climate crisis. The Environmental Protection Agency is expected to unveil a new rule today to overturn regulations put in place by President Obama. A top United Nations official on sustainable energy described the Trump administration's move as extraordinarily harmful. Methane has more than 80 times the heat-trapping potential of carbon dioxide. In other environmental news, President Trump is pushing to allow logging in Alaska's Tongass National Forest, the world's largest intact temperate rainforest. Trump has ordered Agriculture Secretary Sonny Perdue to exempt the 16.7 million-acre forest from restrictions put in place over 20 years ago by President Clinton. The group Earth Justice has described the forest as a major buffer against climate change, stating, quote, "The Tongass stores hundreds of millions, if not over 1 billion tons of carbon, keeping the heat-trapping element out of the atmosphere," they said. Trump's move to open up logging to the world's largest intact temperate rainforest comes as wildfires continue to burn in the Amazon in Brazil, as well as near the Congo Basin forest in Africa. Hurricane Dorian is continuing to gain strength in the Atlantic, threatening the Bahamas and Florida with what could become a Category 3 storm. On Wednesday, the storm slammed into the Virgin Islands but did not directly hit the main island of Puerto Rico. However, parts of the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico remain without power. While Puerto Ricans prepared for the storm on Wednesday, President Trump continued to attack the island, describing it on Twitter as, quote, "one of the most corrupt places on earth." Trump went on to describe himself as, quote, "the best thing that's ever happened to Puerto Rico." The 16-year-old Swedish climate justice activist, Greta Thunberg, has arrived in New York City after a 2-week voyage across the Atlantic in a solar-powered 60-foot racing yacht. Thunberg came to the United States to attend upcoming UN climate talks in New York in September and Santiago, Chile in December. Thunberg does not fly due to heavy carbon footprint of air travel, so she chose to make the journey by boat. After docking in New York, Greta Thunberg spoke to reporters about the climate crisis.
I mean, the older generations are the ones who have been causing this problem, and so I don't think they should be saying to us, you should just be a normal kid and do what normal kids do, but you should, because they are the ones who have caused this, and we are just trying to clean up after them.
We'll hear from Greta Thunberg, as well as the youth activists who greeted her and her father, who took across the ocean with her. In election news, New York Senator Kirsten Gillibrand has dropped out of the presidential race after failing to qualify for the next Democratic debate September 12th, which required candidates to have 130,000 unique donors and at least 2% support in 4 official polls. Just 10 of the 20 remaining candidates qualified. Former Vice President Joe Biden, Senator Cory Booker, South Bend, Indiana, Mayor Pete Buttigieg, former Housing and Urban Development Secretary Julian Castro, Senator Kamala Harris, Senator Amy Klobuchar, former Congressmember Beto O'Rourke, Senator Bernie Sanders, Senator Elizabeth Warren, and former tech executive Andrew Yang. Nationwide protests took place in Britain Wednesday after Prime Minister Boris Johnson suspended Parliament, increasing the likelihood of a no-deal Brexit. Parliament will be closed from mid-September to mid-October, meaning lawmakers who oppose a no-deal exit from the European Union would have very limited time to pass legislation supporting any other measures. The UK is scheduled to leave the European Union on October 31st. Some opponents of Brexit accused Prime Minister Johnson of waging a coup. On Wednesday, thousands of protesters gathered outside the British Parliament to denounce Johnson's decision. This is protester Marion Sharples.
I just think it's just incredibly disrespectful that Boris Johnson, that the government think that it can be passed off as normal practice. It's absolutely a tactic. It's absolutely a tactic to limit the amount of time that MPs have to debate this and to push through a no-deal Brexit and take back control.
We'll go to London later in the broadcast. In other news from Europe, Italy's on the verge of forming a new government that could leave the far-right anti-immigrant leader Matteo Salvini out of power. On Wednesday, 2 rival political parties, the Five Star Movement and the Democratic Party, reached a deal to form a new coalition government. This comes after Salvini attempted a power grab last week by withdrawing his support for the ruling right-wing populist coalition, leading to the resignation of Italy's prime minister. In news from the Mediterranean, an Italian humanitarian boat rescued 100 migrants, including 22 children, Wednesday off the coast of Libya. The migrants were drifting in a rubber dinghy that was already beginning to deflate. The rescue boat was operated by the charity group Mediterranean Saving Humans. Italy's outgoing Interior Minister Matteo Salvini recently signed a decree banning the rescue ship from entering Italian waters. The rescue came a day after about 40 migrants died when their boat capsized off the coast of Libya. About 900 migrants have died this year in the Mediterranean en route to Europe. Fighting is continuing in the Yemeni city of Aden as separatists and government forces battle for control of Yemen's interim capital. On Wednesday, backers of Yemen's internationally recognized government claimed to have seized full control of the city, but Al Jazeera reports separatists have since regained control. On Wednesday, the Taliban announced they're closing in on a deal with the United States under which U.S. troops would finally withdraw from Afghanistan after nearly 18 years of fighting. One security official put the withdrawal timeline at 14 to 24 months, but the chair of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Joseph Dunford, said it's still too premature to talk about withdrawing U.S. troops.
I think it's premature. I'm not using the withdrawal word right now. I'm using, we're going to make sure that Afghanistan is not a sanctuary, and we're going to try to have an effort to bring peace and stability to Afghanistan.
The Chinese military has rotated thousands of new troops into Hong Kong just days ahead of a major pro-democracy march set for Saturday. China's described the troop rotation as routine, but Chinese state media reported the new soldiers had undergone military and legal training specific to Hong Kong. Chinese authorities have denounced the protests in Hong Kong, have repeatedly threatened to use force to quell the protests. Since the 1997 handover from Britain, China's stationed as many as 10,000 troops in Hong Kong. Indonesian police have reportedly killed 6 protesters in West Papua amidst escalating demonstrations calling for Papuan independence. The Guardian reports police fired live rounds on Wednesday at protesters taking part in a sit-in outside a government building. Indonesia recently deployed 1,200 additional troops to West Papua and cut off internet access to the region. In Colombia, another social leader was shot dead by armed men Sunday, according to local reports. The victim was identified as Danilo Olaya Perdomo, a well-known social leader who served as president of the Communal Action Board of a rural area of the department of Huila. Also in Colombia, indigenous organizations denounced Monday the murder of 24-year-old social leader Ivan Mejia in southern Colombia. According to the Institute for Development and Peace Studies, at least 702 social leaders and human rights defenders have been killed since 2016 in Colombia. The Trump administration's announced some children born to U.S. service members and government employees stationed overseas will no longer automatically receive U.S. citizenship. U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services released the new guidelines Wednesday. According to the Trump administration, the rule change will primarily impact the children of naturalized U.S. citizens working for the government or military. The president of the American Foreign Service Association, Eric Rubin, said the rule change was deeply worrying and, quote, a disservice to people who've dedicated their lives to serving their country. President Trump is continuing his attack on the media, but this week he has a new target, the right-wing news outlet Fox News. In a Twitter message on Wednesday, Trump wrote, quote, Fox News is letting millions of great people down. We have to start looking for a new news outlet. Fox isn't working for us anymore, the president tweeted. Fox has long been criticized for its close ties to the Trump administration. According to Media Matters, 18 current or former Trump administration officials used to work at Fox, and at least 5 Trump administration officials work now at Fox, including former White House Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders, who was hired last week. A Denver woman who was forced to deliver a child alone in a dirty Denver County jail cell without any medical care has filed a lawsuit in U.S. District Court. In the suit, Diana Sanchez alleges several nurses and jail staffers knew she'd been in labor for hours, but provided no assistance even after she began screaming for help. Disturbing jailhouse video was recently released and confirms Sanchez's account. The lawsuit charges that the staff, quote, callously made her labor alone for hours and ultimately give birth alone in a dirty jail cell without any medical care. The suit was filed against the city of Denver, the county of Denver, Denver Health Medical Center, and 6 individuals. In Alabama, an African-American man who spent 36 years in prison for stealing $50 from a bakery will soon be released. In 1983, Alvin Kennard was sentenced to life without parole under Alabama's old 3 strikes law, but a judge on Wednesday resentenced him to time served. The computer giant Apple has apologized to its users after acknowledging contractors listened to the commands users gave to the voice assistant Siri on their iPhones and other Apple products. One whistleblower recently told The Guardian they heard Siri users having sex, making drug deals, and discussing sensitive medical details. Apple, Google, and Microsoft have all faced criticism recently for allowing workers to access the voice recordings of users in an attempt to improve their services. And in news from Africa, human rights defenders continue to call for the release of Nigerian journalist and activist Omoyele Sowore. Sowore, who publishes the online news site Sahara Reporters, was arrested August 3rd after calling for nationwide protests under the banner Revolution Now. He ran against President Muhammadu Buhari earlier this year in an election he said lacked a level playing field. A coalition of press freedom organizations and human rights groups recently petitioned the United Nations and the African Union, while a group called the African Renaissance Organization sent a petition to the U.S. Department of State asking the U.S. government to apply pressure on President Buhari for Omoyele Sowore release. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. After weeks of anticipation, the Swedish climate justice activist Greta Thunberg arrived on the shores of Lower Manhattan Wednesday afternoon after a 2-week voyage across the Atlantic Ocean in an emissions-free yacht. Greta Thunberg was welcomed on land by more than 1,000 supporters and reporters at the North Cove Marina. As Greta's yacht sailed over the horizon and past the Statue of Liberty, youth climate activists chanted, "The sea levels are rising, and so are we. And we are unstoppable. Another world is possible." The 16-year-old began her journey to the U.S. and southwestern England. Greta Thunberg doesn't fly. She chose to make the journey from Europe to the U.S. aboard the Militia 2, a 60-foot racing yacht covered in solar panels. The young climate activist is kickstarting a months-long tour of the Americas. For her first action, she'll be joining New York students climate striking outside the UN Friday morning. She will then take to the streets for a massive climate march in New York City September 20th, followed by 2 UN climate summits here. In December, she'll attend the COP25 climate summit in Santiago, Chile. Greta Thunberg became an international icon of resistance last year when she began skipping classes to stand outside the Swedish parliament demanding her government take action to confront the climate crisis. Her weekly protest inspired millions, sparking a global movement of student strikes for climate. This is Greta Thunberg speaking just minutes after docking in Lower Manhattan on Wednesday.
I want to thank everyone so much, everyone who is here, and everyone who is involved in this climate fight, because this is a fight across borders, across continents, and it's as you said, it is insane that a 16-year-old have to cross the Atlantic Ocean to make a stand and this, of course, is not something that I want everyone to do. The climate and ecological crisis is a global crisis and the biggest crisis humanity has ever faced. And if we don't manage to work together, to cooperate, and to work together despite our differences, then we will fail. So we need to stand together and support each other and to take action, because otherwise it might be too late. So let's not wait any longer, let's do it now, I guess.
After her brief opening remarks, Greta Thunberg answered questions from reporters. One asked if she'd heard about the raging wildfires in the Amazon rainforest in Brazil and Bolivia causing unprecedented damage and destroying large swaths of land.
Yes, even on a sailboat in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, I heard about the forest in the Amazon rainforest, the fires in the Amazon rainforest. So and it is, of course, it's devastating, and it's so horrible. It's hard to imagine. So I mean, we need to. I mean, this is a clear sign that we need to stop destroying nature, and our war against nature must end. And I mean, the Amazon is such a key to addressing the climate crisis and the ecological crisis.
Amy Goodman from Democracy Now! How are you? So President Trump says oil and gas are the source of America's wealth. The windmills cause cancer, he says. What is your answer to him and to the activists who have come to greet you here and who are looking for a message from you all over this country, the historically greatest fossil fuel emitter? What do you say to them?
I mean, of course, oil and gas has its ups and downs, and we need to sort of realize the consequences from a bigger perspective of what it actually does when we use it the way we use it today. And I'm pretty sure windmills doesn't cause cancer. So. And was the second question my message to all the activists, to just keep going. And I know it may seem impossible and hopeless sometimes, but it always does. So you just have to continue, because if you try hard enough and long enough, you will make a difference. And if enough people stand together, fight for the right thing, then anything can happen. So.
Greta Thunberg was welcomed Wednesday by hundreds of young climate activists. One of them asked Greta how old she was when she became an activist.
I first found out about this issue when I was maybe 7, 8, or 9 years old. And then I realized that, oh, this is actually very bad. And I started to read about it more and more. And when I became maybe 11, I became depressed. And the climate crisis was a huge cause of that. And because I just felt that everything is hopeless and there's nothing we can do and no one is doing anything. But then I sort of got out of that depression by promising myself that I'm going to do everything I can to change things. And that is what I tried to do. And I started to go to marches and demonstrations and to join organizations and things like that. But I still thought things were too slow, that nothing was really changing. So I was desperate in a way, tried to do something, just anything. And then this idea of school striking came up, and then I thought, yeah, I might just as well try that and see if it works. And if it doesn't, then I will try something else. And then I did it, and then it became huge very quickly.
Thunberg was then asked about her plans through December.
I am definitely coming to Chile, as it looks now, and I am going to try to get there, of course, without flying. So there will be a lot of trains, buses, and probably even sailing as well. I will figure that out as time goes by. And from COP25, I expect, I mean, that must be some kind of breaking point. This United Nations Climate Action Summit in September now, and the COP25, these two have to be a tipping point. I and many people with me are going to try to do everything we can to make sure that the world leaders have all eyes on them during these conferences, so that they cannot continue to ignore this.
With that, Greta Thunberg left the stage to rest, she said. Again, on Friday, she'll be outside the UN joining young climate activists protesting around the climate. And then the major September 20th climate march she'll participate in New York, a UN Youth Climate Summit on September 21st at the United Nations, and then the major UN Climate Summit in New York on September 23rd. She'll go through the Americas and end up at the COP25, the UN Climate Summit in Santiago, Chile in December. Democracy Now! Will be there covering the summit. After Greta Thunberg spoke, we were able to catch up with her father, Svante Thunberg, whom we first met last year in Poland at the UN Climate Summit. I asked him about Greta's decision to make this trip by sailboat.
It's amazing to have arrived in New York. So we've made a special journey. It's been a huge opportunity. I mean, since Greta decided that she wanted to sail, that was the way she wanted to do it. I mean, you cannot win. She sort of says, you know, I'm going to be hated whatever I do, and someone's always going to find faults in whatever I do. But you know, this is my choice, and this is the compromise she was going to go with. Then she decided, then there's no stopping her. I mean, and she feels very completely at ease, you can tell. So once we got to the boat, she was, I mean, completely calm all the time. I was freaking out a little bit, I must admit.
And explain why she took a boat.
Well, she didn't want to fly, because if she would have flown, I mean, you know, people would have come down on her for that.
Because of the carbon footprint.
Yes, of course, and for being a hypocrite. And then we looked at freighter ship travel, which also, I mean, some people would argue is a better choice, but then again, the emissions from the freighter ship boats are enormous, so she would be enormously hated for that too. So then she landed on the sailing idea. And we tried so many different sailing boats, because they're not very easy to find, but also a lot of them use a lot of diesel to make these trips, huge amounts of diesel. So, and then we were offered this trip, and she sort of said, yeah, this is how it's going to be done. And
why does the boat consume so little energy?
Well, because they're very keen on it. I mean, the crew are very active on the subject. They really fight for the climate, and they really are involved in the climate movement. So, I mean, they fitted the boat with solar panels and hydropower, which is the only one of its kind. I mean, there's literally no other boat that can do that. There might be some private, you know, small boats, you know, but they will take probably like 3 months to cross the Atlantic, so they came to us, and that was also a very important thing. So I mean, they believed in what she was doing. So and once we got going, she was completely at ease, and that was amazing for me to see. And then, of course, I felt at ease, and we had, you know, a great time in this sometimes very crazy environment of this boat, which is incredibly fast. It goes up to 30 knots, which is hard to imagine, and you try to sleep inside of that. It's like, I don't know, it's a surreal experience. We try to film it, but you can't. You cannot sort of, you cannot. It's just, you have to do it. And the sound is completely mad, completely mad. But she fell asleep straight away, and she ate, watched the ocean, and we were just happy. So it was a great time.
Svante Thunberg is the father of Greta Thunberg. He made the ocean voyage with her. When they landed, Greta was greeted by over 100 American climate youth strikers. I spoke with Shia Bastido, one of the organizers of Fridays for Future New York City, but began by asking her fellow activists, 14-year-old Alexandria Villaseñor, what kind of response their strike has received.
The response I've gotten striking has been really supportive from Greta Thunberg herself, and having students in New York City come out and strike and are getting more involved. And students for Fridays for Future New York City, we are going to continue striking on September 20th. It is going to be the next global climate strike, and it will be the Friday before world leaders come to New York City for the United Nations Climate Summit. So we're sending a message to world leaders that they take bold climate action for our future.
And what do you have to say to President Trump, who denies climate change exists?
Really, my message to any world leader is that they have to start taking the climate crisis seriously, or else my generation will continue demanding that they do.
And what do you have to say to politicians who say, well, you're 14, you're too young to vote, why should we listen to you?
Just like Greta Thunberg says, you're never too small to make a difference. And that's why this movement is so strong, is because hundreds of students are striking, and we're all, you know, we're striking because we don't have a voice, because we can't vote. And striking is one of the best ways to get our voices heard.
Unite behind the science! Unite behind the science! Unite behind the science!
My name is Shia Bastida. I am a 17-year-old climate justice activist, and I am originally from Mexico. and I have been leading most of the strikes in New York City with Fridays for Future. So we've been organizing for March 15th strike, the May 3rd strike, the May 24th strike, and now the September 20th climate strike.
And what does this moment mean to you right now? Why are you here at the Marina?
So I think this is a very important moment because America as a whole has been behind climate consciousness. So we need somebody who is going to come and really tell everyone to wake up. And it's very important that we are having the UN Climate Summit, because that's us young people speaking to our world leaders about how this is an intergenerational crisis that requires intergenerational cooperation.
So tell us where you're originally from.
So I'm originally from a town called San Pedro Tultepec in Mexico. I was born and raised in Mexico, and I moved to New York 4 years ago. So in 2015, my town was affected by flooding, and that's what moved my family to move out of Mexico into New York City. And when I got to New York City, I saw that the effects that Hurricane Sandy had on the community, and I realized that the climate crisis follows you everywhere.
So you're leading the strikes at Beacon High School, one of the public high schools here in New York. How did you get involved in activism, climate activism?
So I was invited in 2017 to speak in a conference in Malaysia, and I had never done public speaking before, but I realized the power that my personal story had in comparison to data. So that's why when I came back, I started my school's environmental club, and I really started mobilizing people to go to Albany to lobby your politicians and City Hall, and I testified at City Hall so that they would declare a climate emergency. So all of this happened before the strike started happening, and when I saw that students were striking for climate, I said, we have to mobilize our school.
What message do you have for President Trump, who denies the phenomenon of climate change, that there is a climate crisis?
So to that I say, there is many aspects to the climate crisis. It's not only about our planet heating up, but it's about pollution. It's about air pollution, water pollution, plastic pollution. So if you don't believe that we are going through a cycle of warming, then at least clean up our oceans, clean up our forests, and stop burning them.
And what about the significance of Greta Thunberg? When did you first hear what she was doing in Sweden?
So when I first heard about Greta, I was really inspired by her moral compass, which aligns with my indigenous cosmology and beliefs. I am Otomi Toltec from Mexico, and indigenous beliefs are that you take care of the earth because the earth takes care of you, and we need that reciprocity. And I saw that she had a very high level of morality in saying, you are affecting our future, so we have to take action now. And I think that a lot of people look up to her and believe in her because she's really saying, my generation is going to be the most affected, and that generation is us, and we're calling on you to join us because we cannot vote yet. But we strike today and we vote tomorrow, and we need you to speak for us in this time of crisis.
That was climate youth activist Shia Bastida, an organizer with Fridays for Future New York, a student at Beacon High School here in New York. She was among the hundreds of supporters who greeted 16-year-old Swedish climate justice activist Greta Thunberg as she arrived on the shores of Lower Manhattan Wednesday afternoon after a 2-week voyage across the Atlantic Ocean in an emissions-free yacht. When we come back, a constitutional crisis is unfolding in the United Kingdom, where Prime Minister Boris Johnson has suspended Parliament in a move to push forward Brexit with or without a deal. Stay with us.
There'll
always be in England by Tiny Tim. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. As we go to the United Kingdom, where the country's in an uproar after Prime Minister Boris Johnson announced he's suspending Britain's parliament, increasing the likelihood of a no-deal Brexit. The Queen consented to Johnson's plan Wednesday. Parliament will be closed from mid-September to mid-October. This means lawmakers who oppose a no-deal exit from the European Union would have very limited time to pass legislation supporting any other measures. The UK is scheduled to leave the European Union on October 31st. If Parliament fails to agree to a Brexit deal by that deadline, the UK will crash out of the EU with no deal, a scenario that would have severe economic and political repercussions. This is Boris Johnson speaking Wednesday.
October the 31st, before getting on with our plans to take this country forward. If you look at what we're doing, we're bringing forward a new legislative programme on crime, on hospitals, making sure that we have the education funding that we need. And there will be ample time on both sides of that crucial October the 17th summit, ample time in Parliament for MPs to debate the EU, to debate Brexit and all the other issues. Ample time.
Has sparked widespread outrage throughout Britain. On Wednesday, Britain's main Labour opposition party leader, Jeremy Corbyn, said he's written to the Queen to express concerns about plans to suspend Parliament.
Suspending Parliament is not acceptable. It's not on. What the Prime Minister's doing is a sort of smash and grab on our democracy in order to force through a no-deal exit from the European Union. What's he so afraid of that he needs to suspend Parliament to prevent Parliament discussing these matters?
Britain's Labour opposition party leader, Jeremy Corbyn. Meanwhile, thousands around Britain are taking to the streets. This is protester Marion Sharples in London.
I just think it's just incredibly disrespectful that Boris Johnson, that the government think that it can be passed off as normal practice. It's absolutely a tactic. It's absolutely a tactic to limit the amount of time that MPs have to debate this and to push through a no-deal Brexit and take back control.
A UK petition opposing Johnson's move to suspend Parliament has gathered nearly 1.5 million signatures. Prime Minister Johnson was sworn in as the new British Prime Minister in July. His election was the first time a party's membership directly chose the Prime Minister. The membership of the Conservative Party, who voted for Johnson, represents less than 1% of the British population. Guardian journalist Owen Jones wrote in a column Wednesday, quote, "Call the suspension of Parliament what it is, a coup d'etat by an unelected Prime Minister," he said. Well, for more, we go to London, where we're joined by Ash Sarkar, senior editor at Novara Media. Ash Sarkar, welcome back to Democracy Now! First, your reaction to what just took place.
My first reaction was to be very grateful that we've got an NHS, because I want to be medically induced into a coma, if possible. This represents the most shameless and brazen attack on the British democratic process that has happened for decades. And while proroguing Parliament, suspending Parliament, has happened before by governments who want to get around a sticky patch in Westminster politics, this is the first time it's ever occurred in order to circumvent parliamentary scrutiny of an issue of the importance and the gravitas of Brexit. So it really is quite an astonishing assault on the conventions of representative democracy.
Now, can you explain what Johnson gets out of this? And again, he had to request this of the Queen, who assented.
OK, so let me talk you through the Queen bit first. In this country, we don't have what you have, which is a constitution which is written down. Instead, what we've got is a constitution which works on people generally agreeing to abide by unspoken rules, and when in doubt, look to the past and see what precedent has to offer you. So like I said, Parliament has been prorogued before, so there is precedent for this kind of thing. The last time a government prorogued Parliament to get around a sticky bit of parliamentary scrutiny was in 1997. Another time that it happened was in 1948. So precedent does allow for this kind of thing to happen. But the unspoken rule of the British Constitution is that you don't ask the Queen to get involved in political matters. The precedent is that she cannot say no to her government, but the unspoken rule is don't ask her to get involved. Boris Johnson has thrown that unspoken rule completely out of the window because this is a proroguing which overrides the wishes of MPs who want to scrutinise the process of leaving the European Union. So it really is a way of saying, I'm not going to give you the opportunity to present legislation that could derail a no-deal Brexit. And I also don't want to give you the opportunity to call me to committees to scrutinise government papers or plans. Really what I want to do is have a month-long steamroller going through mid-September to mid-October, which takes us that bit closer to October 31st, the day at which we leave the European Union by default.
And explain what a no-deal Brexit would look like compared to a Brexit with a deal.
So every form of Brexit has some form of economic disruption, as it's bound to. We're leaving a trading bloc which has been one of the prime sources of UK trade since we entered it. So even the softest possible Brexit, where you've got single market access and a customs union, has a little bit of a hit for the economy. But a no-deal Brexit is where every single agreement we have with not just the European Union, but the trading partners that we have through the European Union evaporates overnight. And what that means is we'll have tariffs on our imports. That means that the price of food is going to go up. The price of fuel is going to go up because obviously we rely quite heavily on imports. It means that there are going to be tariffs on our exports. So our already fragile manufacturing sector, so for instance, the sale of cars, that's going to take a huge hit. The baseline prediction is that there will be a contraction of our economy by 8%. That is going to hit the poorest and those on the lowest incomes the hardest. The other thing is that there are political consequences to this as well. Leaving the European Union without any other form of agreement means that there will be a hard border in Ireland. Now, of course, the Good Friday Agreement was calibrated so that this wouldn't happen because a hard border would risk the return of sectarian violence to Ireland and Northern Ireland. So a no-deal Brexit puts that quite fragile peace at risk in Ireland. People have been talking also about shortages of medicine. A lot of our medicine here in the UK is imported from EU countries, even if they're just as close by as Ireland, the Republic of Ireland or indeed France. So there will be medical shortages at least for 6 months, and this is coming from the government's own impact assessments. When pressed on the matter, Tory ministers could not guarantee that people wouldn't die because of a no-deal Brexit. So this is where we are at the minute in the UK. We're facing 500,000 job losses. We're facing medical shortages which put lives at risk. And for what? For one Eton-educated millionaire to stay in the job that he wanted ever since he was a little boy. So we just heard that the Conservative Party leader in Scotland, Ruth Davidson, has just resigned. What is the significance of this? This is pretty significant because Ruth Davidson has been credited with keeping that small segment of Conservative voters in Scotland, many of whom are Remain supporters, on side. Without Ruth Davidson, it's likely that the Scottish Conservatives will face electoral annihilation at the next general election. She knows that proroguing Parliament is a very divisive mood. It doesn't go well with her base, and also it's against her own personal political instincts. One of the things to remember is that when Boris Johnson was campaigning to be the Conservative Party leader and therefore Prime Minister, he was going around making assurances to Conservatives like Ruth Davidson Johnson that he would not countenance proroguing Parliament. Yesterday, he went back on his word. Now, Ruth Davidson has decided that that is a betrayal of trust too far. She cannot, in good conscience, still be leader of the Scottish Conservatives. But then also there are members of the government like Lord Young who have said, we're not putting up with this. However, most of the cabinet ministers who occupy the most important offices of state, so Sajid Javid, who's our Chancellor of the Exchequer, Matt Hancock, who's our Health Secretary, Amber Rudd, who is the Minister for Work and Pensions, all of them have in the past few weeks said that they would not entertain proroguing Parliament, that they are firmly against a no-deal Brexit. However, since Boris Johnson pulled that lever yesterday, they've been saying nothing. They would much rather preserve their own jobs and personal importance than protect the jobs of ordinary working people up and down the UK.
Now, Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, claims that he's suspending Parliament actually to move forward on his domestic legislative agenda. What is that?
That's a lie, Amy. It's just straight up a lie. The reason why he is suspending Parliament is for one reason and one reason only. The day before he announced this move, Jeremy Corbyn organised the leaders of the other opposition parties, the Liberal Democrats, the Green Party, the Scottish National Party, the Welsh National Party called Plaid Cymru, and together they had finally agreed a strategy to block a no-deal Brexit. They would pursue legislative means. So, for instance, passing legislation that would force Boris Johnson to seek an extension of Article 50 from the EU, or indeed to block some of the funding that's been put aside to create a kind of buffer in the event of a no-deal Brexit. That had been agreed the day before. So if you imagine it like a game of soccer, you've got one team which has finally got its defensive line in order. And Boris Johnson, instead of trying to play the ball towards the goal again, has picked up the ball, walked off the pitch and said, let's play again in a few weeks' time.
Finally, 35 days into Boris Johnson's prime ministership, the Financial Times editorial board has had enough and declared its openness to the previously unthinkable. The capitalist paper of record entertained the possibility of Labour Party leader Jeremy Corbyn as the United Kingdom's next head of state, rather than keeping Boris Johnson in power. Can you respond to this, Ash?
I mean, it's often said, may you live in interesting times, and certainly these are times which I never thought that I would live through. I think what this goes to show is that no-deal Brexit, which is a symptom of the collapse of the Conservative Party's orthodoxy, isn't necessarily in keeping with the interests of the financial establishment, because it is such a hit to the economy. And it's such a hit to the economy that you're right, that you've got the paper of, the capitalist classes saying, you know what, we'll take the socialist who wants to redistribute a bit of wealth over the guy who wants to contract our economy by 8%.
Well, we're going to leave it there. Ash Sarkar, I want to thank you so much for being with us, senior editor at Novara Media. When we come back, we remember the legendary peace activist Francis Crowe, who died at the age of 100 in Northampton, Massachusetts. And that number 100 is probably around the number of times she was arrested. Stay with us. always tell the voter what the voter wants to hear by Chumbawamba. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. We end today's show remembering the legendary peace activist Frances Crowe, who died on Tuesday at the age of 100 in Northampton, Massachusetts. Over the past 7 decades, Frances has been arrested countless times, protesting war, nuclear weapons, nuclear power. She was a war tax resistor, refusing to pay taxes to support the sprawling Pentagon budget. She opposed South African apartheid and U.S. intervention in Central America in the 1980s and in Iraq and Afghanistan in the 2000s. She climbed fences in the Seneca Army Depot and was arrested for pouring her own blood on a newly built Trident nuclear submarine just before it was launched in Connecticut. Frances Crowe was last arrested at the age of 98, protesting the construction of a new pipeline. In 2005, I interviewed Frances Crowe in front of a live audience in her town of Northampton, Massachusetts. She described how she became a peace activist on August 6, 1945, the day the U.S. dropped the first nuclear bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. At the time, her husband Tom was a physician in the Army Medical Corps.
I was a bride. My husband was in the Medical Corps in the Army. He had told me a few weeks before that he had heard rumors that we were developing this incredible weapon. And he was at sea when we dropped the bomb, but I was alone in our apartment in New Orleans. And when I heard it on the radio, I really unplugged the iron, left the placemat that I was ironing, and went out looking for a peace center in the streets of New Orleans.
And then what happened?
And then, you know, slowly, we kept moving in the direction of working for change. My husband, when he was discharged, he went to the University of Rochester, where he was studying radiology. And there, of course, the head of the Manhattan Project had been Leslie Groves from the University of Rochester. So that was a challenge. But eventually, we ended up in Northampton, and it was fertile ground for organizing. I found in the early 50s, there were a lot of people very concerned about the atmospheric testing of weapons. So a friend and I set up a Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. My husband worked with the Physicians for Social Responsibility, and we've just continued.
Frances Crowe, how did you move from peace activism to media activism? What is the connection that you see?
Well, after 28 years of trying very hard to organize on issues of peace and justice locally, I finally came to the realization that the only way we were going to bring about change in this country was to have independent community radio. And I had tried to get our local NPR station to carry Democracy Now! And they had refused. And we worked on the University of Massachusetts station, and they also turned us down. So finally, when a friend I heard was broadcasting from the top of a mountain, Democracy Now!, I got in touch with him and said, you know, the road was about to close and we couldn't do it in the wintertime, although he was on the air every afternoon from 4:30 to 5:30. So we tried to get several other venues in Northampton where there would be higher spots. So finally we said, we'll try my backyard. So I put a pole up and we were on the air. And and you know, I've never broken a law that I felt better about it. It gave me a large charge every day. And
By any means necessary. Frances Crowe speaking in 2005. Thanks to her efforts, Democracy Now! Is now heard daily on WMUA at the University of Massachusetts. When I spoke to her last week to say goodbye, Frances said bringing Democracy Now! To the Pioneer Valley was one of her proudest acts. Frances Crowe was also featured in Robbie Lepser's 2019 documentary Power Struggle about the grassroots resistance movement to shut down the Vermont Yankee nuclear power plant. This excerpt begins with Frances Crowe heading to engage in civil disobedience at the plant 1 month after the 2011 nuclear meltdown at Fukushima in Japan. The clip begins with fellow peace activist Jean Grossholtz asking Frances if she'll be bringing her cane to the protest.
You gonna bring your stick with you?
I'm gonna bring my stick, yes.
Well, see, I don't bring mine anymore because they've taken so many of mine away from me.
Oh,
You know?
yes.
I had some good ones that had a whole thing on the end.
So I just need to take my ID for when we're arrested. My problem is my balance isn't good.
Yeah, well, mine isn't either. I fall all the time. I fell in a mud puddle walking the dogs the other day. My jacket, my boots, I was completely covered in mud.
Well, my problem, when I fall down, I can't get up.
Well, there's that, too.
Mary Ann is going to be the lead car, and Susan, you'll be the second car. If we go through the first set of gates, which will be open, we've breached security. And then probably the second set would be open. And they would be in the process of shutting it as we were walking towards that. And so then that could be the gate that we would chain shut. So we're all going to be arrested. There's no doubt about that.
So backseat folks, especially you, if you see a policeman, just somebody duck, because I'm only supposed to have 4. We just don't want to be stopped, and everyone will get a ticket.
I'm here because I think this is very dangerous. We're facing the end of life on this planet if we don't do something about nuclear power. When I heard about Fukushima, I was devastated. I felt I've got to get there at Vermont Yankee because it's our potential Fukushima.
We must take this action and shut it down now. No more accidents, no more leaks, no more lies, no more. Enough. Buzz is coming. Shut it down now. Here comes the buzz.
We would like you to leave because you are trespassing on Vermont Yankee Entergy property.
No, I'm not leaving.
Well, I've done everything that I know of to do, and all I have left is my body, and to put it in the way to say no. When people ask me, how many times have you been arrested? And I say, not enough.
Frances Crowe speaking in 2011. The Vermont Yankee nuclear power plant was shut down 3 years later. Frances Crowe died on Tuesday at the age of 100. She was in hospice, surrounded by her family and friends, survived by her 2 sons, a daughter, and a global community of activists in the peace-loving community around the world. And that does it for today's broadcast. To see our interviews with Frances Crowe and Greta Thunberg, you can go to DemocracyNow.org. Passing the torch. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Tammy Warrenoff, Libby Rainey, Sam Alcoff, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen, Hani Masood, Sharina Nadura, Taymarie Astudio, and Maria Taracena. Mike DeFilippo and Miguel Noguera are engineers. Special thanks to Becca Staley, Julie Crosby, Hugh Gran, Miriam Barnard, David Prude, Ishmael Darrow, Vesta Godars, and Karl Marxer. Tomorrow, we continue our special, death and resistance on the U.S.-Mexico border. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us. Our website is democracynow.org.